No, mi vedo un trozo qua perché che mi ha mandato se sta partito. Se siete qualcosa.
Thank you, Zach. You actually anticipated my question, a question I wanted to ask you at last, and I would probably reformulate that and ask both of you to give me a more elaborated response to that. But before me going into the transatlantic dimension of the Belt and Road Challenge, and before giving the floor to the audience, I wanted to ask you, either of you, whether you may tell us something more specific about the role Italy has in the Belt and Road scheme. Whether it has a specific position, and if so, why is Italy's position different from other countries? I mean, we know that Italy is the biggest economy among the 150 odd countries which have already signed a memorandum of understanding in support of the BRI with China. Italy is the only G7 country to have done so. And this critically is a difference. It is a difference in size. But my question is there any difference in quality? And so before going to the audience for their question, I would like you to spend a couple of words on Italy's specificity, if there is any.
Christine, you may have different views, but I'll just give you my opinion, which is that I think Italy is really important to the Chinese Belt and Road strategy. And I think it's important in two ways. First, there's no question that the United States has tried pretty hard to convince most of its close friends that Belt and Road has some potential geostrategic issues of concern. And I think for many in China, there's a view that if China can convince a couple of states close to the United States that actually the Belt and Road is something that they should sign on to, that it does sort of undermine this U.S. view. It undermines the U.S. push back against the Belt and Road. So I do think there's some concern in Washington about that element. And as you said in particular, that China is very influential with some groups in Europe, right? Certainly you hear a lot about the 16+1 grouping in Europe, and the Chinese have been very active in that engagement. But the one area that the Chinese, I think, have really struggled.
Actually, Zach,
yeah.
I don't think 16+1 is an issue widely known in Italy. So
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, so one thing that China has done in Europe is it recognizes that some of the larger countries in Europe, like Italy, are going to have a little bit different view from some of the smaller countries in Europe. And that maybe the smaller countries are more amenable to dealing with China on economic issues, on political issues. And so China basically set up this group called 16+1, which is 16 European states, 11 of which are EU members. And they have attempted, in my view, to use that as a grouping to sort of undermine the consensus within the EU on certain issues. So for example, if you wanted to get a very tough statement on the human rights abuses going on in Xinjiang, one thing you would need to do is get consensus within, say, the EU, and China is very influential now within 11 of those EU countries through this 16+1 arrangement. I think one issue you'll hear from Americans increasingly is concern that within the G7, which is now one of the major forums that the US has been using to try and use to push back against Belton Road, that you might have a little bit of a break in the G7 to the extent that Italy might be more amenable to hearing Chinese concerns and less willing to speak out on some issues. So that's probably the area that you'll hear most concern about. But I'll say just one last thing, which is that I think that means that Italy is in a really good position to dictate terms on Belton Road projects. So these other countries that are smaller and weaker and have much less leverage with Beijing have a lot less ability to actually change the terms of the projects. The Chinese may just walk away. But I think Beijing really, really wants Italy to be part. And that gives Italy great leverage to determine exactly which projects are going to happen and how they should happen and make sure that the standards are held. So I think that actually puts more of a premium on Italy on working hard on the details of these projects to make sure you get exactly what you want out of them.
So the floor is open to questions from the audience. So if any of you, don't be shy. Yes, please. If you could identify yourself first.
Personal history with China, as I lived in China in the early 70s.
Oh, wow.
So I was a young state citizen that had the fortune of actually living in China 2 years. So I have a personal link. Okay, thanks. And of course, I'm glad that Zach, yes, finally made some objective comments, because what I heard in the, so far before his last comments were to me a one-sided American vision of the whole story. Of course, why is the United States so concerned? Well, you say there is a geopolitical challenge, but geopolitical challenge is an euphemism for fear of losing hegemonic position in a global world. Unfortunately, President Trump, with his ultra-nationalistic approach, has launched a new international disorder by rejecting most of the multilateral agreements, rejecting most of the international multilateral institutions, so creating a real potential challenge that can actually damage the West, America, and Europe. Well, one more comment is that I'm sorry to say that the White House is not telling the American people that in a commercial war, who is losing, who is really being damaged most is not China, it's the United States. Because, 30 years ago, China needed all the technology and needed America and needed Europe much more than today. Today, it's more interesting for China to look at Africa, Latin America, and for supply of raw materials. So what I want to say is that in this circumstance, in this picture, global picture, it is better to have China as a friend rather than as an enemy. So I cannot approve more than what Italy has done by approaching China as a friend and accepting to participate in a project that is a vision that no other country is proposing, not the United States and not Europe, but China. And last word is that Italy has the wisdom, and like Zach said, to check, control every project, terms and conditions of every project. Thank you so much.
Thank to your question. I mean, before we actually started, we had a brief talk with Christina and Zach, and I told them, look, you are going to come across this objection that all these talks the United States does about China's threatening the sovereignty of other countries sounds a bit odd here in Italy, because people would tend to think that the same process, we underwent the same process in our arrangements with the United States, in the sense that the United States does exert a lot of influence over Europe. So one objection you come across is, why not to offset that with China, particularly at a time when the United States doesn't seem to be so friendly and so supportive of the transatlantic relationship? Is it not better to rely on China also as an offset to that, and not only as an offset to US or to the Trump administration's disruptive transatlantic policies, but also as a way to keep up as much of the multilateral system to which China is ambivalently but yet still attached in place, as much as possible, of course. So this is a very big question. I wanted to first ask anybody else if he or she has a question there. So we'll collect 2-3 questions before going back.
Thanks. I'm Sergio Vento, retired diplomat. My last assignment was Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to meet friends from the American Enterprise Institute, although of a different generation. Listen, I appreciate very much this booklet, Critical Risk, Environmental Impact. Let me say, with a point of irony, that it sounds like all the criticism which developing countries, or how we say today, emerging countries, we're addressing to European neocolonialism in Africa or in Asia, or American imperialism, as a matter of fact. The point is that China has learned very fast, let's say, how to be an imperialist and neocolonialist country. Tomorrow in Croatia, just next door from us, there will be the 8th edition of a meeting between the Chinese Prime Minister with 14 or 16 Eastern European countries, ranging from Baltic states, Poland down to Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and as a matter of fact. In my analysis, I must say that this is a far more effective penetration of China into the European texture than, our ports. So obviously we have been discussing 2 weeks ago much about Genoa, Trieste, and so on. But I think that there is room for infrastructure investments, because all these Eastern European countries, although being a member of NATO, being a member of the European Union through, in my view, a too fast integration process, not integration, sorry, admission process, which is far from integration, as a matter of fact. So there are countries who badly need Chinese investment, technology, and so on. Infrastructure or manufacture, and so on. Well, what I would recommend to our friends both the American Price Institute or the Center for New American Security, is also, when addressing the problems with Italy, to take into consideration the fact that in Europe there is competition. Moreover, at the time when we have sanctions toward Russia, we have sanctions toward Iran, we have a turmoil in North Africa. I mean, a number of markets are closing. China is offering itself as a great partner, thanks also to its admission to the WTO and so on. And at the time also when, let's be very frank, as among friends one should be, when the United States also is to a certain extent withdrawing to a certain extent from the business, international business arena. We would welcome American investments in our ports, in our infrastructures, so, but where are they? Thanks.
Over there, please.
Hello, good morning. My name is Claudio. I'm a graduate student in international relations, and actually I have two brief questions. The first one is that in the last week we have seen that within the European Union there are divergent positions on the Belton Road. So I'm wondering why there is no EU policy on the Belton Road. Is it related to the fact that EU member states want to maximize their national interest, or is it related to the fact that China gives priority to bilateral relationship bypassing the European framework? And the second question is, do you think that the Belton Road is actually undermining global standards in terms of environmental standards and transparency standards? Thank you.
Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? Yes, over there. This last one, then I will go back to you guys.
Thank you. My name is Eva Jakobsson Belomi. I actually was in the first meeting of 16+1 in Warsaw, you know, like with the Prime Minister at the time, Wang Jabbar. I served actually and worked for my country in commercial diplomacy in Beijing for 5 years. So I also have a personal relationship with China. And now I'm actually teaching international business here in American University, John Cabot University here. And first of all, I really love that when I came here to this meeting, I thought it's going to be kind of this bipolar, you know, like either US or either China approach, right? It's very, very nice and like open, and I think it's very on cooperation-focused discussion, right? So Martin Wolf just recently in Financial Times, he wrote that we don't have to look at China kind of like from the competition side, but maybe cooperation, right? So there's my question, why Americans are so much focusing on competition? It's kind of US versus China. Why we are not looking at cooperation, right? And the other kind of part of the question, when you were analyzing One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road Initiative, were you looking at the historic perspective as well? Because the Silk Road was there, right? You know, like connecting Italy and China. If we look at the 15th century, Admiral Zheng He, he was going across the globe, you know, like, and basically looking at economic perspective of China as a place, you know, like to have an impact. It's maybe not so much as geopolitical approach, you know, like a power approach as we Westerners or Americans want to see. Maybe it's just a commercial touch, no?
We'll actually go back to you guys. When Christine, do you want to start perhaps?
Go ahead. Sure. So I guess to first address the question about whether Belton Road is actually eroding standards for transparency and environmental sustainability. I think the concern that we had when we were sort of going through these case studies was that, you know, before actually initiating these projects, there wasn't due diligence being done as to how exactly these projects would impact the sort of ecological systems and local communities. And so oftentimes these projects were sort of being rushed into, and As a result, in many cases, I think you sort of had belated realization of what sorts of impacts that these projects were having. For example, when we were looking at the Jakarta high-speed railway, there was no publicly available information about the way how the stations were being built, how they would sort of infringe on the property rights of communities that were living around the stations, and how they would increase the impact of, environmental events like landslides, or, as it's a very, Indonesia is at high risk for, monsoons. And so I think that without the public being able to have that information about how these projects would impact their safety and livelihoods, I think that there needs to be open public debate. And in many of the cases we examined, there was no opportunity for those sorts of debates to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that it's having that open public debate. I think in a democracy is a measure of a well-functioning democracy, and that's something I think we'd like to see on projects, whoever is actually in charge of them, right? I think Nino's point is really important here, so I want to spend a minute on it, if that's okay. Even 2 minutes, okay. So I'm a believer in alliances. I worked at NATO. I've spent most of my academic career focusing on alliances and what makes them work and what makes them not work. And I do not support the approach that Donald Trump has taken either to NATO or to our alliances in Asia. And I won't speak for Christine, but I don't think many people in Washington support that approach. Now, I understand why President Trump is frustrated by burden sharing. When I worked at NATO, we talked about burden sharing all the time then, and I think anybody who's spent time at NATO understands that they'll be talking about burden sharing in 20 years also. But I think the way you judge an alliance is whether both countries in the alliance, or in NATO, all the countries, feel like they're actually more secure with the alliance than without it. And I think what we should be focusing on is, in NATO, are we actually having the military capabilities we need to secure NATO? And I think sometimes the burden sharing debate forgets that that's actually the point. It's not about who's spending how much money. It's about whether we get the capability out of the alliance that we need. And I think in that regard, actually, when we talk about Belt and Road, it's really important that the alliances, whether they're US alliances in Asia or alliances here in Europe, have at least real difficult discussions about our different views, whether that's of Russia or of China. And one of my concerns is that I don't think we've been having those difficult discussions the last few years, right? The discussions in Washington on China are so different from even the discussions with many of our allies in Asia. So it's not just an issue of US-Italian relations. If you went to Australia, their discussion about China is totally different as well. And I think that's a real problem. But let me just give you a couple of thoughts of why I think Americans have changed their views on China that are not at all connected to Donald Trump, and why I think those views are likely to stick regardless of whether Trump is in office in a few years or not. One is human rights issues. So I will tell you, 3 years ago, you just didn't hear much about human rights issues in China. It's not that they weren't a concern for some people, they just weren't politically salient in Washington. But I think the fact that there are 1 million Uyghurs in detention in Xinjiang for many American politicians has become a real serious problem. And that's not to say that the United States doesn't have its own human rights concerns and that we've done everything perfectly, but it has been very difficult for China, I think, to manage that Xinjiang issue in Washington, in part because Democrats are very often focused on human rights issues, and Democrats were the ones that were so focused on cooperation over the last 8 years under the Obama team. And so there's this growing feeling that actually the engagement that the Obama team did, which was very focused in many people's views on cooperating with China, basically failed. That it didn't improve the human rights issues, they got worse. That it didn't actually fix a lot of the economic concerns. So on things like intellectual property rights, there was an agreement made in 2015 between Obama and Xi Jinping, and it was broken. So Americans feel like that has failed. And then on security issues, whether it's South China Sea or Taiwan, we think that actually the security situation has gotten worse. So my view is there's no doubt that some of this is connected to how Americans see our role in the world, and it's tough to be a declining power and see your role decreasing. But I don't think that's the basis of much of the concern about China. I think that is a secondary issue. But that's a debate that Americans have all the time, every day. Just one other point, because there were so many good issues raised. I absolutely think we need a positive investment strategy, not just in Italy, but globally. You can't fight something with nothing. And unfortunately, this is one of the challenges of having an America First strategy. It's really hard to say to the American people that you're going to put America first and then go put a big figure out for foreign aid or foreign investment or even trade agreements because the president opposes the trade agreements. So I think it's really been difficult for the Trump administration to have a coherent, logical strategy that tells countries, first, that they should be skeptical of Belton Road, but second, that we are also not going to necessarily have this positive engagement plan. So I think you're seeing a lot of debate within the United States about how the U.S. can engage more positively, economically, around the world. And we've seen some efforts on a bipartisan basis. The big one recently has been something we called the BUILD Act, which is basically an effort to go increase the amount of development finance we do globally. So it's a drop in the bucket compared to some elements of Belton Road, but there is a bipartisan recognition that the U.S. has to have this positive agenda, and we don't have it now. And I think that's a real concern for many of us. And just the final thing is, those of us in think tanks, our job is to try and do objective analysis, and I think we don't always get it right, but part of what we're trying to do is think about in 2020, if you had a new administration or even a second Trump administration, what could they do better, right? And it's not that everything's going to get fixed overnight, but where are the areas that they could make some tweaks and come out with policies that would make the alliances stronger?
Thank you, Zach and Christina. Any more questions? Yeah.
Just one word. The irony is that I spent many more years in the United States than in China, and then I am the happy father of 3 American daughters.
Please. That was a funny addendum. Can you wait for the mic?
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Augusto Sisani. I'm a student at Luis Guido Carli
Can
of
you raise your
International
voice,
Relations.
please? We can barely hear you.
Sorry?
Can you raise your voice?
Yes. And just briefly, do you think there will be any repercussions in the bilateral relations between Italy and the United States after the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding? And if yes, how? And if you could give some examples, just this. Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions? Come on, don't be shy. There is a lot to ask about. Over there, perhaps? No. Well, then, implications for Italy of the U.S. opposition to the signing of the MOU. Who wants to go first?
Maybe I'll take a shot at that. So I think there are 2 possible implications. One, and this is always the case in bilateral relationships, right? Like, one implication could be that Italy has much more leverage with the United States after signing the MOU than it did before, right? Because the United States is paying more attention to views here in Italy on China. and the United States may be more willing to listen. And there's no question, right? I study alliance literature, and one way you can increase your leverage in an alliance is to work with a third party, and that increases your leverage with what we call the patron, right? And so I think you can make an argument that Washington will be paying more attention now, having signed the Belton Road MOU, than it was before, and it may give Italy some leverage in certain areas to make some asks. I also think the danger in playing this game is that when you do so in an alliance, there's always a risk that you actually do some lasting damage to the alliance. And so I think that's going to be a really difficult thing, not just for Rome to manage, but also for Washington. And it's not to say that we don't have this experience. We have close allies that work very, very closely with the Chinese. The Philippines, the last 3 or 4 years, has worked very closely with China. And it's not that it negates the ability of the Philippines and the United States to work together, but it does add a complicating third factor. And sometimes I think it's given the Philippines a lot of leverage with Washington. And other times I think it's actually made it difficult for Washington to make long-term commitments when it's not quite sure which direction Manila might go.
And we haven't even touched upon the issue of Huawei and 5G. Please.
Could you insist concerning Huawei?
I'm not insisting, but I'm happy you're raising that. So I'm happy you're picking that up.
First of all, thanks for your insights. Michael, a master's student in international relations. And concerning the digital aspects, since we're talking about this, since China will project, build, and also take care of, let's say, all the infrastructures concerning both the belt and the road projects, I'd like to concentrate on the maritime profile, let's say. Constructing and projecting all the maritime path also concerns building all the infrastructures that will carry out all the internet cables, all the sea routes. We know that about 99% of all informations are on the sea routes. So by building these infrastructures, China itself is going to protect all this. One important note is in Sicily, where we also have US military bases. So how do you see this? Thanks.
Which I'm not entirely sure is really the case right now, because we've been seeing quite important developments at the EU level, particularly with this strategic communication by the Commission, which is one of the it is kind of a different document you are accustomed to seeing coming out from the Commission. It really has a strategic undertone. It identifies clear challenges. It even conceptualizes China as a systemic rival, which I understand you don't agree to, but you have to engage with the questions, Nino. The questions about the 7 challenges, which are not hypotheses. These are actual risks, actual implications that you may find empirical evidence in when you study the projects that China has already been developing. So this is not this is not a matter of we fear that, but we have seen that. So I am very much sympathetic with your view of engagement and strategic offset, but you have to engage with these questions, and you have to engage with the main question that China is an authoritarian state. And you cannot gloss over that. This is really important. That actually marks the ultimate difference between China and the United States. And it is not only an authoritarian state, but a state which, thanks to new technologies, is really increasing its ability to amass information about individuals living under its jurisdictions and not only under its jurisdictions. So while I am very much sympathetic to the notion that we cannot by no way align with a one-sided view that everything that comes out of China is threatening, I fully share your skepticism, really, but you have to engage with the issues Zach and Christina have raised in this discussion, because as I said, these are actual, this is actual stuff that has happened, not that may happen, perhaps, or perhaps not. And you have to engage with the broader question of what are the main implications of getting very close, of engaging so closely with a state which is fundamentally authoritarian in its governance system and totalitarian in its capacity to monitor and potentially even oppress its own citizens. These are not questions you can just throw down the road by kicking the can. These are really fundamental questions, very difficult questions, very difficult. And I agree that in theory, Italy is in a fantastic position right now. It can actually use its links to the United States and the rest of the European Union member states to say, look, we have signed this MOU because we do have a need for liquidity, for infrastructure developments. Let us get together and let's see how we can actually bend Chinese rules to our own standards and show the Chinese that they are welcome here in Europe, provided they abide by rules we also shape. And if we do that together, there will be a massive political weight. If you leave us alone, you, the United States, you, France, you, Germany, you, the rest of the European Union, it will be harder for us. This involves a degree of strategic depth in Italy's policymakers, which I'm very much afraid is simply not there. But the work, the job of the think tanks might actually be that, to provide them with a technical and expert analysis of ways to do that. And actually, this gave me the idea of a fantastic project we can do together. I actually answered a question in your place. I don't know if you want to add something to this discussion we're having. Marco's questions.
Sure. So I think your question on sort of the digital components is important. And I think it's interesting because, when the internet was first developed, the sort of American perspective was that it could be a tool to sort of democratize otherwise autocratic countries, and it was sort of going to be an equalizing factor. But in many ways, that logic has sort of been flipped on its head in Beijing, in that, its way of connecting people and its use of telecommunications infrastructure is being used to actually reduce the costs associated with autocratic regimes. And so I think it's been both interesting and very troubling to see that sort of reversal and the sort of bifurcation of telecommunications infrastructure.
Yeah, and just to build on that, you brought up 5G, and I think this is something which is obviously getting a lot of attention in Europe and in Washington. My view is, look, we have to recognize in Washington that there's going to be Huawei and ZTE equipment globally in most networks, right? And that's just because the Chinese telecommunications equipment is cheaper by a good amount. but that there also are risks that come along with that equipment. And so I'm not a huge fan of some elements of the U.S. administration's approach in trying to sort of threaten our friends and tell them, no, you can't have any of this equipment in your systems. Because, yeah, maybe the British will decide not to have Huawei equipment in parts of their 5G infrastructure, but we know that it's going to be present in Africa, in Southeast Asia. And so I think we're going to have to figure out how to live with that equipment in parts of our networks. But I do worry, especially in U.S. alliances, about where we have that information infrastructure and whether we can actually protect the critical infrastructure in the alliances themselves. So I think that's one area where the administration, I think, has some work to do. And actually, in this regard, the Brits and the Germans have been doing a lot of work on how to protect 5G infrastructure and make sure that where there is 5G infrastructure, that we know how to actually make sure that the data is going where it's supposed to go and not, say, going back to servers in China. So my view is the U.S. should be helping them do that. Italy should want to be cooperating in those efforts. And if we can make sure that the data is going where it's supposed to be going and that the most critical elements of our infrastructure are protected, then 5G involvement, first of all, is going to be a reality, and second of all, it can be acceptable and cheaper in some areas than having Nokia or Ericsson, which are more expensive systems.
We still have almost 15 minutes left. So if there is, yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Adriano Benedetti. I'm a retired Italian diplomat. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article in which I made an erroneous comparison. I compared the Belton Road Initiative to the Atlantic Charter. But I think that I was right in the essence. The Atlantic Charter, which was signed, if I remember correctly, by the US and Great Britain at the beginning of the Second World War, was a manifesto for the Western influence in the world in the following years. The Belt and Road Initiative is a manifesto for dominance in the world, for establishing Chinese hegemony in the world. I have no doubts about that. The instrument is different, but the objective is the same. Now, in relation to this grand objective, I think that Italy has no choice. Italy belongs to the Western world. It belongs to the values that the chairman of our meeting has recently outlined. So I don't think there is a margin for choice for Italy. But still, although I am not led by excessive sympathy towards the present Italian government, I think that perhaps they made the right decision. Italy is in a process of slow, almost apparently irresistible economic decline. And it has the duty to try to do everything in order to stop that decline. So I think that the decision to sign the Belt and Road Initiative was right. And the US is quite correct in underlining the risks and challenges built in the Belt and Road Initiative. But as a profoundly friendly country to Italy, the US should not take negative reactions towards Italy. It should accompany the Italian government in this difficult task. I And these are two additional comments I would like to make. The risks and challenges that you have rightly outlined are real, but they are particularly real for developing countries, which do not have the institutional structure, the political efficiency to counter those challenges and risks. Italy, in spite of all its difficulties, has a long tradition, has counterpowers in its institutional framework. So I think that the risk that is actually present is worthwhile running. The second comment is... Pardon me? Yes, of course. I don't think that I've been talking more than other people. I have the impression that China, in spite of all the political intelligence which has been accumulated over the centuries through its great civilization, is not in a position to administer the relations with the other countries in a proper way. It has a concept of a built-in predominance in its outlook, which, in my opinion, would lead China to encounter great difficulties in the application of the Belt and Road initiatives. It will face a sort of backlash sooner or later. Thank you.
We actually asked that question. You said in the beginning that you made the comparison between the Untitled Chapter and the Belton Road, and you now assess that comparison wrong. But then you said that in essence it was right. So what is it that you find wrong right now?
No, I said that I made the right comparison. No. I made the right comparisons because I understood 2 or 3 years ago that the Belt and Road Initiative was a manifesto for conquering the world.
Wrong, I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
It is, you have to make an additional effort to compare the two manifestos. But the two manifestos are being put on the same level because they were manifestos in order to dominate the world and give the political line to the world for the future. So if you consider strictly the two papers, the two manifestos, you may come to the conclusion that the comparison is wrong, because the first one, the Atlantic Charter, was an ideological manifesto based on democratic values, on political values. The present manifesto is not based on ideology per se. It is based on an instrument, economic, commercial instrument, which has, though, the same objective, world dominance.
Thank you. So I think that the one point I would pick up from this long and interesting comments is that China may not have the capacity of handling all this. What's your assessments? Because you, if I'm not mistaken, the report already highlights some traces of backlash. I mean, you mentioned the Malaysian example. So what's your take about this? Is China actually going to be able to adapt, develop, and become more sophisticated in its approach to the countries targeted by the BRI, or it doesn't have the capacity as a speaker actually believes? Christine, what do you think?
I mean, I think much of the backlash that has received the most attention has occurred in democratic countries, and oftentimes during election cycles when candidates that are running, and you see a little bit of this in Indonesia right now with the incumbent Jokowi facing criticism from his sort of political rival Prabowo in sort of highlighting the bribery risks, the financial and environmental repercussions that countries that are sort of coming to light that weren't made public prior to public debate in an election environment. And so I think that maybe only now is Beijing sort of realizing that in democracies in particular, you're going to face more of the sort of public debate that coincides with elections. And I think that it's sort of grappling with that, but may, because it's not a democracy, is sort of being a little bit clunky in the way that it's trying to adapt its approach.
I think that's a great point to bring up, which is I think China is a bit clunky in how it's executing Belt and Road. And part of this is that the Chinese political system is so unlike any political system in almost any other part of the world, right? That understanding that, for example, in many parts of the world, right, there's substantial corruption. We all know that. And the Chinese often work through officials that are very used to dealing with high levels of corruption. And whereas, there's American law, for example, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that prohibits American companies from engaging in corruption, I think the Chinese are much more amenable to corruption globally, and they see it as less of a problem, in part because that's often how the Chinese system has worked, even within the government, right? To encourage growth in China domestically, there was always an accepted level of corruption by government officials. That was part of how they actually got paid. So of course, when they go abroad and now are trying to encourage growth in certain places, you see that corruption is in part accepted. And I think a surprise sometimes among Chinese officials at the backlash that you see during these democratic elections against the officials who've been gaining from that corruption. And of course, in the United States or many other countries, you'd say, of course you're going to get this backlash when there's a small group that's benefiting so much from these giant investments that are going to specific individuals or specific companies. But I think in China, it's a different system. And so, yeah, I think the word clunky is exactly the right term. And there's no doubt that we've seen Beijing get a little bit more artful in the kind of tools that it's using to push forward Belt and Road. But I think one of the real challenges that Xi Jinping has is there are real economic challenges in China itself, and putting huge amounts of money into the rest of the world for the next decade or two is going to potentially be pretty difficult unless China is able to solve all of its domestic problems. And so I do think there's a risk both that China misreads the political dynamics in specific countries, but also that China's ambitions turn out to be more than what it can actually towards the military and towards domestic security services. So I think balancing those objectives is going to be a real challenge for Beijing in the years ahead.
Well, Zach, thanks. We are perfectly in time. I would like to thank you, all of you, for last question, very brief.
My name is Giorgio Bosc, Special International Humanitarian Law. Now, I would like to strike a note of caution because the Chinese statements in international meetings are often ambiguous and difficult to follow in their an example, from Monday 25 to Friday 29 March in Geneva, there was a conference of experts about the the problem of autonomous weapons, autonomous lethal weapons. The Chinese representative to this conference only said that autonomous weapons could not be trusted to respect the principle of proportionality in the attack. And this means practically next to nothing. And it is well known that in China they are building in a massive scale these autonomous lethal weapons. So, I mean, any statement made by official Chinese authorities must be taken, as we Latins said, cum grano salis. Thank you.
I don't know if you want to react to this. Well, then we take your comment as our last word. And I go back to thanking you again for being here, for engaging us in this discussion. Of course, thanks to the Monte dei Paschi di Siena for providing the room, and above all, thanks to you, Christina and Zach, for enlightening our views of China and China's Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks for hosting. Well done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I was actually serious about the idea of this project. I mean, if you think there might be some interest on your end of doing even a small project on how Italy can actually approach the BRI and how the United States and Italy, along with the European Union, can actually coalesce together, coalesce around a single strategy or a single approach to BRI-related projects. I mean, that would be great.
I mean, I think we would definitely be interested in publishing something like that.
No, I'm not saying about publishing. I'm saying actually I'm talking about doing a real research.
Yeah.
Real research. I guess we might involve, for instance, the foreign ministry here. Perhaps they might be interested in